So hello everyone and welcome to our Study of Religions research seminar series. I'm delighted to have Brian Hoggard today, who's going to talk to us about magical house protection, the archaeology of counter-witchcraft. Brian Hoggard has been studying history, archaeology and folk beliefs since his teens. His undergraduate dissertation focused on folk beliefs and witchcraft. He noticed there was a huge amount of work which could be done to further explore the archaeology of witchcraft, and at that point, back in 1999, his research escalated into a major project which has culminated in the publication of his book, Magical House Protection, The Archaeology of Counter-Witchcraft, which came out with Berghahn publishers in 2019. So I'm happy to pass you over to Brian now.
Okay, hello everybody. Thanks very much, Jenny, for inviting me to speak today. I hope you'll all find what I'm about to do interesting. We've been negotiating with Microsoft Teams this morning to work out how to make it work for my presentation, but it should be fine. Here we go. All right. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So one of the things I'm really hoping that might come out of this talk today is really an increase in the amount of find reports that I get from Ireland, because we do have some records of some of these objects from Ireland, but not nearly enough in my view. So if any of you can go forth and uncover more finds after today, that would be hugely appreciated. But basically, you already know that I'm going to be talking to you about the archaeological evidence of magical house protection. If any of you are interested in looking a bit further into the topic, you can have a look at my website, or you can follow me on social media. I'm also on Instagram, or of course you can have a look at my book. But yeah, without further ado, let's carry on. So for me, this topic began with my reading of this book by Ralph Merrifield. I gather from his family and colleagues that he used to like being called Rafe, not Ralph. But anyway, I never had the chance to meet him. He died just before I had the chance to meet him, ironically enough. But yeah, inside this book, which covers thousands of years of archaeology and history, there are two chapters which look at the early modern period. So we're looking mainly at the sort of 16th to 18th centuries, and in those chapters, which comprise a fairly small part of the book, there is some really fascinating information. And also one of the objects mentioned in that section is the cover illustration for the book. But essentially, I first came across a lot of these objects that were concealed during that period in this book, and obviously, in a study that comprises such a huge span of time as this one does, he didn't go into vast detail on any of the objects, but enough detail for me to get started and to think there's more work that could be done in this area. So Rafe was, I think, deputy head curator of the Museum of London, and so he would come across many of these finds that didn't really make sense in the normal way of things, and he would put them all, or make a mental note to put those records to one side, and ended up compiling this book, which he thought related to all the magical activities of people over the years. Before I start talking about the specific finds that got me interested and the main broad categories of finds that I study in my book, it's important to just sort of think about how things might have been, psychologically speaking or magically speaking, in the distant past. I mean, if we think of a church before the Reformation occurred in England, for example, we're talking about a building that is covered in art internally and externally as well. Images of doom, lots of images of saints, that kind of thing. Lots of magic going on, but also the fact that rituals and services in those days were conducted in Latin, which most people couldn't understand. They were carried out behind a rood screen, so people couldn't see them properly, and they were carried out in candlelight and with lots of smoke from incense. So if we think about a magical ritual today, that's pretty much what it looked like. And so churches, in a way, were very magical places for people. and a lot of people had a very poor understanding of religion, or Christianity certainly. And there are accounts of people being asked, do you know who Jesus is? And they'd say things like, is that God's uncle? They really didn't understand the relationship between the principal figures in Christianity and what they were all doing. And this is reflected in a lot of the practices that we'll be looking at, which appear to combine sometimes Christian elements and sometimes magical elements in the same practice. But we also need to bear in mind that in the past, obviously before electricity, before motors, that kind of thing, people were of necessity just much closer to nature and mortality. If a neighbour died or if an animal died, it could happen visibly within a few meters of where you lived. And so people were much more aware of those kind of things. The night sky was clearer, for example. And of course, there was a lot more folklore. People hadn't had all this stuff educated out of them, if you like. This was their main education, was about folklore and local issues, and from parents and from colleagues and people who lived nearby. So the whole landscape around where people were living was brought to life by folklore about plants, folklore about trees, folklore relating to springs and local deities, folklore relating to parish boundaries and ancient sacred places too. And on top of all of this, we also have the local cunning people. So you have the cunning folk, the cunning men, the cunning women, who essentially are, if we were to use very loose modern terminology, were essentially the kind of white wizards who were really, really grey, white wizards and witches who were basically looking after the local communities and doing the things that now
Brian,
we do.
sorry to interrupt. We're still looking at the Ralph Merrifield slide, so I don't know if that's the one.
That is correct. It will change in a moment, I promise.
Okay, just making sure.
That's all right. Good call. Okay, so the cunning folk were busy doing all these things that we now take for granted from our modern services, like National Health Service, police, etc. Your cunning folk could do things like give you a cure for herbalism, using herbalism. They could give you a charm against the witchcraft that had been carried out upon you. They could help predict who your future partner would be. They could help detect who'd stolen something from you. All of these things, and so those people were pivotally important in the local communities. In fact, so much so that in 1593, George Gifford, who was a priest and wrote an account of his life, he wrote that the local parishioners, he wrote this very jealously and very angrily, treated their local cunning person as if they were his god. Okay, so that's how important these cunning people were. Priests were relatively ineffective at dealing with day-to-day problems, but the cunning person could get to work on all of them for you. Now, a lot of these cunning folk were doing things like they could identify witchcraft that had been done to you. So in a way, they were sort of helping the authorities identify who were the bad witches, if you like. And it's important when we look at the whole nature of witchcraft as a whole, that many of the people who were accused of witchcraft were actually not guilty of anything at all. They were just ordinary people who were sometimes on the receiving end of jealousy or rivalry, or had done something wrong, or sometimes people, because we know this because there are studies in Cornwall, for example, in the early 20th century, which show that if people gave a sharp look to someone, that could be interpreted as witchcraft. So it certainly seems to be true that people would see these sharp looks sometimes in the past as witchcraft as well. And so many of the people who were accused of witchcraft had done nothing more than a sharp look, or had been on the wrong side of an argument. But having said that, and I will change the slide in a second, I promise. Having said that, there is evidence that people did do black witchcraft. We do have objects relating to black witchcraft. So, whatever I've just said, bear in mind that people did do some funny things with objects as well. And so here's one particular example of definitely some magic occurring. We're not entirely sure whether it's good or bad, but we'll let you be the judge of that one. But anyway, in Prestwich, which is a suburb in Greater Manchester, there's a parish church. Next to the parish church is a pub. The cellar of the pub basically burrows into the edge of the churchyard next door, which, as you can imagine, might be a good place to conduct some magic, or some magic to do with dead people. And anyway, in this cellar, it was discovered that there was a false wall, which, as you can imagine, would take a lot of effort to put up, and for it to remain undetected for as long as it did is quite remarkable. when it was investigated what was behind that wall, sorry, there was a little bag containing these figurines, which have been stylistically dated to the 17th century, which are thought to depict the trio of people who were the target of the witchcraft. There was also a pile of what is described as vegetable matter, which I take to mean perhaps some roots or ingredients that have been gathered together. And there was also a dead cat, all part of the same collection of objects that were then sealed up with a wall. Now, there is the possibility that this could be a protective form of magic, as you'll find out later on when we talk about cats. But usually when people have small effigies of people that have been accurately carved, they're usually aiming something bad at them rather than the other way around. And the amount of effort that's gone into this particular find suggests to me that something nefarious was going on. These figures were kept in the pub for a very long time, but unfortunately they are no longer there. But that's just one interesting example. The next one we're going to look at is a curse from Dimmock in Gloucestershire. This one first appeared in Rafe Merrifield's book, but I was lucky enough to be the custodian of this curse for quite a while, so I had it in my house. Essentially, it's a lead tablet similar to the ones that the Romans used to make many, many years ago, but this one dates from the 17th century and was found behind some panelling in this building in the village of Dimmock, which is just on the edge of the Forest of Dean. And it's a curse on a local girl called Sarah Ellis, so it appears to be some kind of act of jealousy or hatred. And it's written in mirror writing, which is so that the devil can see it better, and it's then got some sigils which have been borrowed from one of the popularly copied grimoires that were in circulation during the 17th century. I'm not sure exactly which one, but a very similar curse to this was recovered in Yorkshire as well. So again, here we've got someone very clearly aiming some properly bad witchcraft or properly bad magic at someone. So these things were occurring. Here's another one, a much more recent one. This one's from the middle of the 19th century, from the city centre of Hereford. And this one again was found behind panelling. It's a convenient place to hide something. And essentially what we have here is a peg doll, a very basically made rag doll. So there's a stick with a bit of fabric and some wadding to make a head, and a big skirt wrapped around the outside. Now, the interesting thing about this one is that if I can find my mouse pointer, there it is. If you look along this edge here, you can see there's a paler part to the body of the skirt, and that's because there is a roll of parchment wrapped around the body of the doll underneath the skirt, on which is another curse on a local girl. So essentially what I'm showing you there, and this is just a few examples, and there are many, many more of these. I obviously talk about them in greater depth in my book, but yeah, curses, black magic was definitely occurring. I think that many of the people that were accused of it had done nothing of the sort. The other thing I would also say is that many of these curses, remember, people were living in an era when magic was absolutely real to them, and if they were angry or frustrated about something, you can imagine why somebody would, in a fit of anger or rage, think, I'm going to curse that person and do it using a doll or something like that, and not actually be regarding themselves as a witch necessarily or as a wizard, but just being an angry person in a world where magic was a normal part of everyday life. So it's interesting to think upon these objects like that. Right, so people were scared of all sorts of things. They were scared of witchcraft, as we've already discussed, which was probably the principal fear in the period that I'm looking at. They were also scared of fairies. We're talking pre-Victorian fairies, which obviously in Ireland you've got a lot more and better law on fairies than we have in England, but there is still some good stuff over here about the race of the fairy who are, essentially living a parallel universe to us, not the little Tinkerbell fairies of the Victorians. But, you had to be careful not to offend them. So that was part of what people were scared of. People had also learned from the church to be scared of demons as well. So, images, sculptures of gargoyles and devils and paintings in the churches of hell, that kind of thing. So they were worried about those kind of things too. But essentially, all of these things, people needed to think about how are they going to protect themselves. And one of the types of finds that people used to use quite a lot is witch bottles. Now, in the course of my research, I would say that this is the only type of counter-witchcraft that came specifically out of the period of the witch trials. I'd say that virtually all of the other ones that we look at had existed. They predate the period of the witch trials for sure. Essentially, witchcraft has always existed. I'd say in all cultures, people have believed in the supernatural, and there have always been good people and bad people, and there have always been good supernatural experts and bad supernatural experts, aka witches, wizards of the white and black variety. And I'd say for as long as humankind have existed, so have they. And basically, there have always been so-called normal people who aren't so skilled in that area, who had to learn ways of trying to protect themselves from the worst kind of people out there. And so most of the objects that I study just cover a much broader period than the period of the witch trials. But this particular type, the witch bottles, seems to have been created in direct response to the kind of mass hysteria about witch trials that there was across much of Europe and indeed America and Eastern Europe as well during the early modern period. So the earliest witch bottles that I've come across myself tend to date from the third quarter of the 17th century. So we're talking 1660s, that sort of time. This particular one dates from a similar era. It's from a little village called Felmersham in Bedfordshire, and it was found a foot or so under the ground, just in front of the fireplace of this little cottage, and it was inverted, so it was upside down in the ground. We're not entirely sure why that is, but there's a few various sort of guesses about that bit. But yeah, there are at least, I'd say, around 200 of these particular ones that have been found. This type of bottle is quite distinctive in appearance. It's called Bartmann stoneware, and essentially it was popularly manufactured in the Rhineland of Germany. The Germans basically had a way of making stoneware, which was incredibly popular and exported all around the world, essentially. It took us a long while to catch up. In England, for example, it was a good sort of probably the late 17th century before we got the hang of making our own stoneware. But we only had earthenware up to then. So we imported in England vast quantities of these bottles, and it was specifically to acquire the stoneware properties, essentially. They'd be shipped over full of wine or beer, which would be drunk, and then they'd be reused again and again and again. Now, you can see that they're quite anthropomorphic in appearance. They have a big round belly, a kind of evil visage, evil face, and often a nice armorial device on the tummy as well. Sometimes it's a coat of arms. Those are more typical of the ones that were made for home use in Germany, but the ones for export tended to be relatively simplified and relatively crude. This one has an image similar to what we're going to talk about later as a daisy wheel, except this has 8 points, not 6. You can see that the finish on the bottle is a kind of salt glaze, which makes it look quite leathery, which sort of adds to the humanness of them. Okay, so the earliest examples, as I mentioned, tended to use this type of bottle. The type of bottle changes as we move through time, as the availability of bottles changes and we get better at making our own in this country, and then glass comes along as well. But initially, Bellarmines, they're nicknamed Bellarmine bottles because there was an evil cardinal called Bellarmine who everybody kind of popularly liked to hate, and they thought this looked like a mean face on these bottles. They were nicknamed Bellarmines, but they're actually a type of Bartmann stoneware. Now, with these bottles, when they're recovered from archaeological contexts like this one, they generally have a certain range of contents. They have hair. This is an example of some contents from Merrifield's book. So they normally have a lock of hair. They normally have a collection of pins and nails which have been deliberately bent, and they also have urine. And quite often they'll have nail clippings and toenail clippings, that kind of thing. Here's another example of contents. This is from a bottle that was found in Greenwich at the turn of the 21st century. Here's an X-ray of the one that was found in Greenwich, and you can see again this one was found inverted, and so some of the nails and pins had accreted together in the neck of the bottle. And sometimes where they accrete together, they begin to rust and the iron expands, and sometimes it cracks the bottle open. The urine inside. We know that there's urine because my colleague Dr. Alan Massey, who's a retired research fellow at Loughborough University, he's done lots of analysis of the contents of these bottles under a scanning electron microscope and various forms of chemical analysis, because when a bottle's been underground for 250 years, it stops being urine and starts being broken down into the various components which make urine, and you have to kind of do a bit of a detective journey to work out that that's what it once was. And he has done that. Now, the study of witch bottles has been kind of muddied by the existence of some texts about boiling up a witch bottle, which exist from the late 17th century onwards. So, for example, 1671, Joseph Blagrave publishes a book called The Astrological Practice of Physic. And in that book, he recommends that if you think you've been bewitched, you should stop the victim's urine in a bottle with pins and then heat it, and this would cause dreadful pain to the witch. And that the idea is that this pain that was caused to the witch would eventually force the witch to seek you out and ask you to please stop causing me this agony, stop boiling it, and I'll unbewitch you and it will all be sorted. And there's various tales about this very thing happening. In fact, a slightly earlier text called Sadducismus Triumphatus by Granville in the 1660s has a similar kind of recipe in it. And it even says that, there was one time when they did the spell and it didn't work, so they decided to bury the bottle, and then a local wizard subsequently died. So there's lots of similar tales about that. But the boiling seems to be different to the ones that we find that are buried, because when we look at all of the texts that talk about the boiling, they don't mention putting hair in, they don't necessarily mention putting nail clippings in, they don't mention deliberately bending the nails, they don't mention that you need to place it by the hearth, for example. And when we look at the archaeology of these witch bottles, at least 50% of them are found near the hearth, so obviously that's very important. Another 25% of them are found at a threshold, and the remaining 25% can be found in a variety of places, usually boundary points in the building. Yet the boiling process that is referred to in some of these texts, it doesn't matter where you are to do those. You've just got to be in the presence of a cunning person who's going to help you do it. And so that's clearly a different process, a different thinking process going on with those. And also when they talk about the pain caused to the witch, it's all about the bladder, and that this bottle represents the witch's bladder and you're causing pain to the witch's bladder. But none of that seems to be happening with the ones that are buried specifically in specific locations. I think the locations by the hearth is very important, hearths and thresholds. So here we're talking about the places in the house that are the most vulnerable. And if these bottles that are recovered from the ground, which have hair and nail clippings and bent nails in them, are supposed to work in the same way as the boiled ones, it wouldn't matter where they were buried. But the buried ones definitely are different, in my opinion. I think there were two practices going on that were slightly similar because they both used urine, but urine was the main way people treated medical conditions, but also it's a way, or certainly the main substance they took to their medical practitioners for analysis to try and get treatment. But also here you are, you've got this anthropomorphic device, you filled it with your own wee, your own hair, your own nail clippings, so it smells of you, it's designed clearly to represent you. And then in it, you take these pins and nails, which you deliberately kill or sacrifice before putting in. So then you've got these ghosts of pins and nails inside them. And so you're putting it by the fireplace. It's the only place that's always open to the sky. If you're in your house feeling scared of the supernatural, the way you're going to expect badness to come into your house is through the chimney, which is always open to the sky. So you put something there to pretend to be you, so that hopefully it'll attack it instead of you and become impaled on the nails and pins that have been killed within it. But also, you have to bear in mind the sort of witchcraft neutralizing properties of iron. So, these pins, when I see all these pins and nails inside these bottles, I see it also as something that is toxic to witches. And so I think that the ones that have come from the ground, there we're looking at a kind of trap, a kind of lure and a trap. You're trying to divert bad energy coming down your chimney away from coming inside the house to attack you. You're trying to fool it into thinking it's found you so that you can neutralize the threat. Whereas the ones that were being boiled, the ones that are being mentioned in the texts, that's more of a kind of pseudo-scientific practice, and is different. but related because it has some similarities. Okay. Now, witch bottles, they've taken, since the late 17th century, they've kind of changed a bit. So we get some that are in glass, some that are in earthenware, and we get some even in metal, and we get them used certainly right up until the early 20th century, and I wouldn't be surprised if people still use them. So here are a few examples just very quickly. This one was discovered in Dorset. As you can see, it's very small, it's just a few inches across, it sits in the palm of your hand, and when you first have it in your hand it feels solid, and then after a few seconds it starts to turn to liquid. It's very peculiar. I had the pleasure of looking after this one for a bit. Again, Dr. Alan Massey, he analysed the contents and discovered that inside the bottle was a mixture of beef fat, beef tallow, and spring water. And it seems that this was a witch bottle designed to protect cattle. So perhaps a cow had died, the farmer had thought that perhaps it was witchcraft that had done it, taken some of the fat of the cow into the bottle, but put in some holy water as well from a local spring. The idea being that whatever witchcraft or evil was attacking the cattle might then try and attack or get the fat from inside the bottle and then be neutralized by the holy water within. Here's another example from the late 18th century, where we know that in this particular house, the lady of the house was dying a long lingering death, and it seems that multiple efforts of unbewitching her were undertaken, because we found in the end 3 bottles embedded in the hearth surround. And let me just, it's quite difficult to control, I'm getting there, 1 second. And then here's an example from Suffolk, in a house that eventually this particular witch bottle story was featured on a programme on BBC Two called The History Detectives that I was on. And again, a typical early witch bottle from the area. And this particular guy, just to give you an example of how people react, because when people find these things in their homes, they suddenly become incredibly superstitious and scared, even if they are normally not superstitious or scared about anything. And this guy was kind of frantic once this was discovered in his house. We sent it away for analysis. He was ringing every day, when's it coming home, when's it coming home? And we did all the analysis, very similar to the one at Felmersham. And when it came to reinterring it, which they wanted to film, I went there and he said he specifically wanted me to put it back in the hole because I was his first point of contact. And as I was lowering it into the hole, suddenly into the room came this group of nuns that he'd hired to come in and pray around me as I was placing it back in the hole, which I very much was not expecting. So, but yeah, you can see the kind of reactions people have even now when they find these objects in their homes. So that's a quick look at witch bottles. Another type of find that is probably the most common kind of find of all is concealed shoes. Now, excuse me. Now, concealed shoes, incredibly common. There is, believe it or not, in Northampton Central Museum, a concealed shoes index that was set up by my colleague June Swan. And it was her that first realised the significance of these. She's a curator at the senior curator at the Boot and Shoe Museum in Northampton, and she was getting all these reports of shoes that were being found sort of just resting on ledges in chimneys or found in large collections behind panelling or behind walls, and she just thought, this is happening so often, I'd better start making a note of it. And so at Northampton Central Museum there is a concealed shoes index. It has records of well over 2,000 examples of these from around Britain basically, and the world in fact. She takes reports from anywhere, or took reports from anywhere. She's not been very well lately. And I've received many reports of shoes as well. And there's a variety of theories about this. The first thing to point out is that we can get these shoes anywhere from the 14th century up to the early 20th century. I would also point out that in only a 10% of all of the discoveries of shoes are pairs. The rest of them are always a single shoe, and it's almost always a very well worn shoe. Sometimes you can find them in family groups, so you clearly have like 2 adults and a child. Sometimes you find them just singly, and sometimes you find them in big hordes. So for example, this one from Sittingbourne was part of several hundred shoes that were recovered from this former pub called the Plough in Sittingbourne. The Plough was demolished, and within the Plough there were at least 3 large hoards of material that were discovered within that single building. And so the thinking about why people are concealing shoes, there's quite a bunch of ideas, really. One thing about shoes is that you need to bear in mind some of the fertility thinking that was going on with shoes. So, you know, the old legend, there was an old woman who lived in a shoe, all these kind of tales, things like that. And so there is some magic which talks about how women would sometimes want to have a shoe from a woman who'd recently given birth, because they would hope to catch some of the fertility from that woman. And maybe they could keep that in the bedroom, so it's nearby. There is also infant mortality to consider. So sometimes people would retain the shoe or a shoe or a pair of shoes from a child that had passed away. And we do find many examples of that, but I would say that usually those are concealed quite reverently, and the shoes are normally in quite good condition when that happens. But the vast majority of shoes aren't like that. They're more like this, you know, very well worn. And there is a legend of an unofficial English saint called John Shorn, and he existed in the beginning of the 14th century in a village called Long Marston. Is it Long Marston? Hang on, North Marston, sorry, in Buckinghamshire. And he was a real priest, and as I say, he's never been officially canonized, so he's not an actual saint, but unofficially in England he was regarded as a saint. And pilgrimages to his shrine were incredibly popular, going for over 250 years, probably second only to the shrine of Thomas à Becket in Canterbury. And the pilgrim badge, as you can see on this image, shows a devil being trapped in a boot. And this is the legend of John Shorn, is that he's reputed to have trapped the devil in a boot, or cast the devil into a boot. And the popularity of the pilgrimage to John Shorn's shrine was so great, and this badge was so widely distributed. And also many parish churches had images of John Shorn just on panelling, on the rood screen, that kind of thing. So it was incredibly widely known that there was this legend that John Shorn was able to trap a spirit in a boot. And I think that this popularized the idea that you could use footwear to trap or repel evil from your homes. And this is part of the reason why we find so many of them. I think it became just a kind of living tradition, and maybe people did it without even knowing about John Shorn later on. But certainly it was very widely known for a very long time. And also, you know, we think about what we were talking about with the witch bottle, that it contains this kind of essence of you, and it's going to act as a diversion for any evil coming into the building that might attack it instead of you. I think that shoes act in a similar way as well, because by the time these shoes are very well worn and you wanted to discard them, they might have various slashes in them from trying to relieve the pressure of corns, that kind of thing. And they were uniquely yours, in the same way as Cinderella's shoe was uniquely hers. You know, these shoes were uniquely yours and could act as a unique identifying thing that something coming into the building could be fooled into attacking instead of attacking you. And then there is some folklore that talks about spirits not being able to travel backwards very easily, which I always find quite fascinating. And if I struggled to travel backwards and I got stuck in a boot, I think I'd be stuck there, you know. So maybe there's something in that as well. But certainly incredibly popular, the legend of John Shorn, and I think it explains that tradition. We also get on a lot of church roofs, not just church roofs, but usually particularly so on church roofs, in the lead, but also on stone, as in this case on a stone bench at Canterbury Cathedral. We often get a lot of shoe outlines that are carved onto surfaces. Now, this could be a simple form of making your mark for illiterate people, but many of them do have initials and dates in them, so these people were at least somewhat literate. So I think that the practice was more to do with trying to tie some of the sanctity or sacredness of a building to your own existence through your own unique print of your foot. June Swan, the lady who started the Concealed Shoes Index at Northampton, she referred to these as soul prints, as in your soul, you know, the print of your soul on a and also coincidentally the sole of your foot, soul prints. So I think that's quite an interesting idea. I have recently at a church in Worcester, which is near to where I live, found a couple of examples of these shoe outlines, but carved vertically in a place where to carve around your foot you'd have to basically do some yoga at the top of a church tower to do it. So they're remarkably enduring, if you like, these symbols. They crop up an awful lot. Right, now the next type of find I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a kind of trigger warning really, because this includes cats, dead cats. I don't want anyone who loves cats to think that I don't love cats. I do love cats, but you're going to see some images of some dead or dried cats coming up, okay? So this is your chance to look away if you don't want to see that. So when I started looking at this topic way back in 1999, as it was then, one of the first reports that was ever sent to me of concealed objects was actually from Eckington, which ironically is the village that I lived in before I came to university, and I never knew the person who reported it or anything. It was a real striking coincidence. So this cat was found in between layers of thatch on what is essentially a 15th century cottage in a beautiful little Worcestershire village. The thatcher thought that the layer of thatch was probably 17th century, roundabout then. We know that some of the earliest cats we've come across are again from the 14th century, a bit like shoes. So it's an old practice. You can see that this cat is well, it has been squashed quite fairly flat really by the layers of thatch. The thatcher who discovered it was absolutely convinced that it had been placed there. It hadn't and couldn't have got there by itself. And so he thought it was remarkable, the owner thought it was remarkable, and they found me and showed it to me. So I went and visited and took some photos. Before I go any further, you should know this cat has been put back in the thatch where it was found. So it's right back where it was, just with some new thatch on top of it now instead of the old, slightly worn thatch. Obviously, it is minus a few flaky bits, but apart from that, the cat is intact back where it came from. There are lots of these. I get reports regularly of these. So there are even some hotels and pubs that have them on display, like this one, the Red Cat Hotel in Norfolk, which you can easily Google to find. Interestingly, when this one was first reported to me, the story that came with it was that some locals didn't believe that it was a real cat because it looks like it's been varnished at some point and placed in this glass display box. And a local dentist took it to work and x-rayed it and discovered that it very much is a real cat. But yeah, cats and parts of cats, like for example here, a cat's skull. This is from the late 19th century, recovered from right underneath the middle of a hearthstone in a property in Brighton. Yeah, very, very common. And some of these cats we find with very clear evidence that they've been attached to timbers and beams. There's no doubt about it. Clearly been pinned, stapled, tied, plastered in. There's one from a church at Clifton up in northern England at Penrith, which has been plastered in the roof of a building up between, and so the cat exists between plaster and slates up in the roof. We found ones where an old bread oven was sealed up, and within the bread oven was a cat deliberately placed. And again, this idea of protecting voids, just like you have hearths and thresholds and boundaries, we also get voids. So where areas of buildings are cut off, you often find objects in there as well. Now, the thinking with cats, people used to think maybe they were there to scare away vermin. I'm not so sure. Well, I don't believe that one, basically. I think rats, which are our main type of annoying vermin, quickly then, when an animal is dead and they don't fear it at all, they'll quite happily run over it or eat it if they feel like it. So I don't believe that one for a second. Some people talk about foundation sacrifices as well. I would say that foundation sacrifices are different. They're to do with offering to the spirit of place, in order to remove any possible bad luck that might come from cutting the ground at that place. And many of these cats are found much higher up in the building, and in many cases we can see exactly when they've been added into buildings during modifications and repairs as well. So I think that the way we have to think to understand this is to think about the properties of the cat. We've got essentially a mysterious little creature that behaves in unusual ways. It's semi-nocturnal. It's a very good predator on pests. And I think people thought there was a bit of magic about the cat. And also there was a popular belief, certainly in the islands around Ireland and Britain, that this idea of the witch's familiar as well, that could take the form of a cat. So if you had a friendly pet cat, maybe you could harness its spirit to do good for you, and also to do good while you slept, because cats being semi-nocturnal you can go to sleep knowing that the spirit of the cat might be patrolling your house, helping keep it pest-free, essentially, in a more spiritual way. And so I think we're looking at a little kind of guardian spirit, essentially attached to the building. And I'm fairly clear, after 20 years of seeing many examples of this, I'm pretty sure this is what's going on. Like we often find examples of these in between roofs and floors. So, for example, a 1950s bank in London, in Woolwich, where right above the main door to the bank, above the ceiling, in between the floor, between the first floor and the front door, was a cat. This is a 1950s property, remember. And then, simultaneously, we'll look at a mid-17th century property in Wales that has a cat in exactly the same place above the door. It seems to be a common thing to protect the threshold in a way with a cat like this, and that we're tying the spirit of the cat to the place to act as a guardian. There are many of these. If you were to go and ask any local builder who works on historic buildings, have you ever found a dried cat? I'd be surprised if they don't say that they have, unless they just want to hide it. Right. Next one. So another really popular form of protection is written charms. Most of the examples that we have been able to study well date from the middle of the 19th century, obviously paper being very prone to decay, so there aren't so many really old ones, but we know that people have done it for a long time. In mid Wales, in the mid-19th century, there was a pair of brothers who were particularly prolific as charm makers. They were a pair of cunning folk. And so the National Library of Wales, Aberystwyth, has quite a lot of examples of written charms just in their collections, which you can request copies of if you ask. But there are lots of others that have been found throughout England and elsewhere. Now, the interesting thing about these charms is when you look at them the first time, you have to look at them as artifacts before you look at them as documents. And they're generally very tightly folded up, often folded up inside a sheet of lead, or tucked into a crack in a building, or sometimes in a small bottle or phial. And that in itself makes them interesting. And then when you start looking at the art, if you like, on the charm, we've got an abracadabra word triangle in the bottom left-hand corner. We've got one of the sigils, which was on popular grimoires in the 17th century in the bottom right. And then along the bottom, we have a load of astrological symbols. So we've got the moon, various stars, we've got Mercury, Venus, Jupiter. We've also got Ya, 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 which is sort of God, essentially. And then we've also got, in the main body of the text, we've got lots of little separations from three X's. And I'll just read some of the text so you can get a sense of it. So we've got a lot of magic, we've got a lot of astrology, we've got some ritual magic and some, Middle Eastern magic, essentially. But the text of this particular charm reads, which was found in Sarn in Wales, it says, Lord Jesus Christ, be the preserver of William Pentrinnant, his cows, calves, milk, butter, cattle of all ages, mares, suckers, horses of all ages, ewes, lambs, sheep of all ages, pigs, sows, and prosper him on this farm to live luckily, safe from all witchcraft and evil men or women, spirits or wizards, or hardness of heart. Amen. So we've got a mid-19th century charm, very specifically protecting his or her property from witchcraft and evil. And I think that's really interesting at that time. Now, what we need to bear in mind when we're looking at a charm like this is that this is actually the end part of a whole service offered by a local cunning person. So it seems to be that a local landowner or property owner would ask or commission a local cunning person to come and do some protection magic on their property. And this would involve several visits to the property, going around all the boundaries of the property, maybe doing several rituals, maybe burying things all around the edges of the property. And it would culminate finally in this one big charm being concealed somewhere at the centre of the property, usually concealed somewhere close to where the owner lives. And so these are very powerful charms, specifically produced by a cunning person. And we've got maybe 20 or 30 good examples of these throughout Wales and England. It'd be nice to see some from Ireland. So here's an example of one that was found in Sheffield, for example. There are many, many more. Right, the next find type I'm going to discuss is horse skulls. This is kind of a whistle-stop tour. I'm sort of whizzing through this really. When I'm not sharing the screen, you might be able to see Herbert. He's up on the bookcase behind me. Okay, so I bought Herbert from an old antique store. He was over 100 years old before I bought him, so I haven't contributed to the demand for horse skulls, you'll be pleased to hear. But basically, horse skulls have been found in many concealed contexts throughout, well, we can say America, all of Europe and Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales, Scandinavia, Russia, probably a bit further afield than that as well. Certainly in Belgium, France, Germany, that sort of area, there are examples from there too, and Romania, which we'll talk about in a second. So, you know, one of the first examples I came across was from a pub in Herefordshire called the Portway, which is near a place called Staunton in Wye, where 24 horse skulls were found screwed to the underside of the pub floor. A nearby place called Peterchurch, there was a private hall belonging to a manor where a similar number were found underneath that hall as well. The explanation given when people asked was that it made the fiddle go better, made the music sound better. And then another example would be 3 horse skulls that were found together in a bell turret from a church in Northumberland at Elsdon. You can see in this particular box there are 3 horse skulls in there, which they've now made a nice display of it, actually. I'm going to read you a little passage from Enid Porter's Cambridgeshire Customs and Folklore, because it has a very interesting example of a late 19th century example of a horse's head. Right, so it says, in 1897, W.H. Barrett recalls that his uncle, a builder, secured the contract in 1897 for erecting a primitive Methodist chapel at Black Horse Drove in Cambridgeshire. One day he sent his nephew, then aged 6, with his elder brother to the knacker's yard to buy a horse's head. When the 2 boys returned with it, they watched the workmen dig the trench for the foundations, and then saw their uncle carefully mark the centre of the site by driving into the ground a wooden stake. The men gathered around while the uncle uncorked a bottle of beer, then the horse's head was placed in the bottom of the trench. The first glass of liquor poured from the bottle was thrown onto it, and when the rest of the beer had been drunk, the men shovelled bricks and mortar on top of the head. It was explained to W.H. Barrett that this was an old heathen custom to drive evil and witchcraft away. So that seems like a combination of like a foundation sacrifice and also a counter-witchcraft practice at the same time, but right at the end of the 19th century. So that's pretty interesting. So it clearly has to do with protection. And a bit like with cats, as I said earlier on, many of these examples actually, they're not found in the ground, a lot of them. Some of them are found, as I said earlier, screwed to the underside of some floorboards, sometimes up in a bell turret, sometimes associated with a chimney. There have been lots of examples found in Wales, for example. Dr. Ewan William, he's written a really good paper in around about the year 2000 about horse skulls in Wales. Lots of interesting things there. So, for example, in Wales, 1827, 4 horse skulls buried in the foundations of a Calvinist chapel. Dr. Williams says that just about all chapels in Wales have horse skulls underneath them, and I believe him. There's some found in Llandaff Cathedral as well. In Ireland, lots of examples, north and south. Also in 1945, someone called Sean O'Sullivan conducted a survey of horse skulls in Ireland. He was a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, and he found that there were many examples of horse skulls buried underneath the stone in front of the hearth. And when people were asked what was the reason for the horse skull being there, they said it made the dancing sound better. So similar to the horse skulls. Similar to the example in Herefordshire. Now, I think that this acoustic theory is a bit of a red herring. I think that this was an excuse for why, you know, if you were walking down the street with a pair of horse skulls under your arms and the local priest said, "What are you up to?" "Oh, you know, I'm just improving the acoustics of my house," you know. I think that it was an excuse, and that it was used so much that eventually some people thought that maybe that was actually the real reason why people were burying horse skulls, because old Herbert is up there. I'm a guitar teacher as well as being someone who researches history and archaeology. And there's no improvement when I'm playing my guitar having Herbert around. So I'm not really an acceptor of that theory. I think that it's more to do with, again, we look at the properties of the animal, a bit like we did with cats. Horses are quite mysterious, quite sensitive. They're also a benevolent kind of friend to humans. They're thought to have a sixth sense. They can detect earthquakes earlier than most. They're very sensitive animals. They also, although they don't always choose to do this, they can sleep standing up and with their eyes open, meaning they've got this vigilant quality about them, which again is similar to the cat being awake while you're asleep. And also, when you look at a defleshed horse's head, when you look at essentially the horse skull, it looks like a different kind of beast. It's more like a scary monster, really, and you can use it to scare away lesser monsters, really. It's a bit like having a gargoyle on a church. And then also we have horse skulls often used in many folk dances. This is a modern Mari Lwyd, which some friends of ours, John and Susan Exton, have created. They have a white one and a black one, and they all go and take part in the Mari Lwyd ceremonies, which essentially is where a horse skull kind of sweeps through a village, scaring away lesser spirits, in my opinion. That's part of the function. And then we also have similar traditions in Cheshire, the soul caking, and then in Kent with the Hooden horse. This isn't with an actual horse skull, but certainly with a representation of a horse. Right, I'm going to skip to my final part of the talk now, because I'm running short of time and don't want to keep you up. But yeah, horse skulls very widespread in people have used them in Romania in orchards, for example, to keep evil away as well. So we'll talk about some marks on buildings now as well, just very quickly. So daisy wheels, these are these six-pointed compass drawn patterns, which you can make. You draw a circle with your compass, put the edge of the compass on the edge of the circle, draw another circle where they intersect, put the point of the compass there and draw another until you've gone all the way around the original circle, and you end up with a six-petaled flower. Now this symbol has been in use since at least 1600 BC in an architectural context. You find it throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Egypt, and much wider than that. We also find it in this country. Some people think that that particular pattern might even be derived from some of the earliest Neolithic tombs in Ireland, for example. Some of the earliest depictions of the sun are actually quite similar to this. But that link, is tenuous, but it's certainly a valid avenue of exploration. We find this symbol not just included into actual tracery designs in churches and to patterns on furniture, but we also find it graffitied or scratched onto things, as we do in that Chelvey Court in Somerset, which is a 15th century mansion in a village in Somerset. And then we also have it added onto furniture like this example of a corner cupboard that is in our house. Or, for example, we sometimes get it included as a decorative motif, as we do on this door, which was from a farmhouse in Somerset, which is a beautiful door. I'd love to own that. That's a 17th century door. It has daisy wheels included into an ornamental design. It seems that when we ask about what this symbol means in different countries, many countries seem to have a very clear and ancient memory of it being a solar symbol. And it's almost like you have the light of the sun keeping darkness away, and it's used essentially as a protective symbol. Here, for example, is a crudely badly drawn one, but from a 1920s property in Cambridgeshire. So it's still used even into the 20th century. Just a couple more things to say now. So here's Marian marks. So these are M's and W's where the V's overlap. Obviously, archaically, people used to draw a W with a pair of overlapping V's. But when you start studying marks and graffiti, you'll find a disproportionately huge amount of them. And as indeed I did, and my colleague Timothy Easton, who established the whole field of protection marks studies, because this wasn't mentioned in Ralph Merrifield's book. And he came up with the hypothesis, with the help of some Catholic friends, that it related to the Virgin Mary. So maybe the two V's mean Virgo Virginum or Virgin of Virgins, which is a plausible theory. And even if that isn't the right theory, when we look at the overlapping of V's and the flipping over of them to make them into M's, that is the modern monogram of the Virgin Mary, so it certainly is a good explanation anyway. Here we've got some of these marks appearing in the chantry of Prince Arthur, who would have been King Arthur had he not died early and his brother became King Henry VIII instead. But yeah, here we have a tomb where prayers were being said for this man's soul for hundreds of years after his death, and yet still someone felt the need to put some of these Marian marks there. We also, I'm skipping through, this will be the last bit. So we also get these deliberate burn marks as well. And recent experimental archaeology has shown that it can take up to 5 to 10 minutes to make one of these burn marks. You need to burn the surface of the oak where it chars, You then have to scrape away the carbon layer for it to allow more burning to take place. And you can end up with burn marks that are big enough to fit your thumb in sometimes. And it's definitely been established through archaeological research, which has been published in the Vernacular Architecture Journal, that this is how these were made. And they very commonly occur on hearths and any other timber surface. But for example, here in Wales at the House of Llancaeg, which is open to the public down near Merthyr Tydfil, there are over 100 of them on this particular dormer truss. This is the same building that immediately below they found a dried cat as well, and lots of other objects in this building as well. So before I shut up, I'll just tell you about Hidden Charms 4, a conference that's happening in York on April the 15th, so very soon. You can find out all about that if you go to my website. But anyway, I will draw my talk to a close because the hour is up, and I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Brian.
You're welcome.
There'll be an echo, so you might just mute yourself for a second. This used to not happen before on Teams. It seems to be, since the latest upgrade, there's a lot of kind of glitches with it. So I'll open the floor now to questions and comments. So I'll try and go in the order that they're in. Ethan, you had your hand up first.
Oh, hello. So one of the things that struck me early on was you mentioned that people were still and I guess this was sort of answered shortly afterwards, but there was something that implied that people still worshipped non-Christian deities in rural areas in the British Isles even after the arrival of Christianity. So how common was that, or like especially local gods and
Okay, so I probably wouldn't characterize them necessarily as deities, but I would certainly say that the practices carried on, and there's evidence for these practices carrying on well into the 1930s. There seems to have been a shift in consciousness at around that time for some reason, and so like many of these practices were still very widespread up until the 1930s throughout Britain, and it seems Ireland as well, and some areas it continued for a lot later than that. And I wouldn't say, like, I think that people misunderstood Christianity for a very long time, and that essentially they ended up worshipping many different deities within the same religion. So you have the Virgin Mary, Jesus, God, various saints, and they were all often worshipped separately by people. And so it's almost like they formed a kind of pantheon similar to paganism in a way anyway. But yeah, there were lots of enduring protective beliefs that continue well into that period.
Thank you.
So I'll go in the order of the chat next, so that there was a hand up and then there were some questions in the chat. So Nicole mentioned when you were talking about the shoes, interesting in the context of the old woman who lived in a shoe. And she asked, with the shoe outlines, I wonder if this is tied to the hoodoo practice of hot footing.
I don't actually know. I couldn't define that practice if you asked me to, so I'd be interested to know more.
Do you want to say anything, Nicole, or do you want to explain hot footing, or will I move on? So Kieran mentioned the idea that cats think about killing their owners as they sleep. And Tom says he remembers a cat in the wall of the city library in Limerick.
I've seen the one in Limerick, because there's one in the museum there, isn't there?
And Ethan asked what was the name of the library that gives you copies of charms?
Okay, you'd have to ask them, and you probably have to pay for them now. But yeah, it's the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, and you'd have to specifically speak to a librarian about them.
And Lars asked, what was the book that had the example of beer poured on horse skulls?
That would be Enid Porter's Folklore of Cambridgeshire, which is 1969.
And Lars also said horses also have a very long history as a sort of holy animal or spirit animal. Lots of examples of horse magic from the Viking era.
I normally go into that a bit more, but I've kept it short today. But yeah, I agree with you. You're right.
So go back to the hands. So Davide, next. You want to unmute yourself? Yeah. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you if you're speaking. You're muted again now. I can read out your questions instead. So you've two questions. Do you want to try unmuting yourself again, or if you want to type them in the chat? So I can see that your microphone is not muted, but we don't hear you if you're speaking. Okay, so it's in the chat. I'll just read it out. So Davide says, I'm not really familiar with literature here, but I do wonder if you have found any differences between insular, for example, British protective practices and continental ones in terms of objects used in building deposits, rituals, etc. A couple of times you've mentioned Romania. For example, thanks to Sonia Hoggard, which I'm probably pronouncing horribly wrong, we know pretty much about the horse as a depositional sacrifice in Finnish buildings. In your presentation, we've also seen horse skulls. I've always been struck by similarities in magic here, but are there specifically local traditions? So that's the first question. And then also I want to ask you, Davide wants to ask you if you also get occasionally reports from countries around the Mediterranean, such as Spain or Italy. I'm Italian and I would be very interested to know about Italian examples of concealed objects. I'm not interested in symbols carved in wood or stone, example in barns, thunderstones, but in objects such as shoes, dried cats, etc.
Okay, there's a lot to get my teeth into there. Yeah, so Sonia Hoggard, which I think is her name, she's a friend of mine actually. So yeah, I've known her for a long time, since 2016 at least. So yeah, her research is excellent, very similar to mine. In fact, we've collaborated on various things. So yeah, horse skulls. What I've tried to do in my talks is I tend to pick out the types of finds that are thematic across the world as much as possible. So there are lots and lots of very specific regional examples of a lot of these charms and magics, but then there are also some that seem to have bigger, more international connections and seem to be more consistent if you look across the whole of Europe. So horse skulls, for example, I don't have any records of horse skulls from Italy, but it's probably more to do with the fact that I don't work in Italy than the fact that they're not there. There could well be some there. Certainly we've got examples from other parts of Europe. Anecdotally, certainly from Germany. I'm sure we've seen examples from Belgium, a couple of examples from France. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some in Spain, but I have not come across them myself yet. In Romania, yes. In Russia, yes. Finland, well, the whole of Scandinavia, yes. In Russia, they seem to be associated a bit like they are in Finland, more with the concept of pestilence rather than specifically warding off evil more generically. So in Russia, for example, there's an example in the Ethnographic Museum in St. Petersburg of a horse skull facing a beehive, and they used to set them up next to beehives to protect the bees from pestilence and evil that might corrupt their honey, for example. But also, we do still get them in Scandinavia, for example, sometimes under the cardinal points of buildings, protecting all the directions that evil might come in. And sometimes we have them specifically against hearths. So back to your question about Italy specifically, I've definitely had examples of dried cats reported to me from Italy. I've not seen them myself. I know you said you're not particularly interested in marks, but there are lots and lots of good marks from Italy. So a lot of the daisy wheels, there's lots of those in Italy, for example. But again, you know, if you want to pay for me to go to Italy for a little while, do some research, I'll come back to you and tell you about all the great things I found there. I'm sure that you'd find, if you were to look at the rest of Europe as any indication, you'd probably find a lot of concealed shoes. You'd definitely find cats. I wouldn't be surprised if you find a lot of animal bones. And definitely we know the marks are already there. But the Mediterranean does specifically have a lot of counter-witchcraft to do with the symbol of the eye, as I'm sure you know. So there'll be a lot of that there as well. I hope that's a little bit of use to you.
So Lars, do you have another question? Or is that an old hand?
No, I wanted to comment on the door from Yeovil with the daisy wheel on it. It's struck me that it's very similar to something that we find in Norway on also on farmhouse doors, and typically on the food storehouse. And I was quite surprised when I was in Setesdal. It's a quite remote and traditional region of Norway, to find that people are still doing that. So it's on all the old farm buildings, but it's also on completely new buildings that are built in the last couple of decades. But I wanted to ask you, the putting this like in the center of the door, that looks like it's obviously designed to protect the house, right? Is that how you would interpret it as well?
Yeah, in that case, definitely. I mean, I haven't seen pictures of your Norwegian examples. I'd love to see them, by the way. If you feel like sending me a picture or two, I'd certainly appreciate it. But yeah, I would say for protection. I mean, that door that I showed you was originally the front door of that farmhouse, and in the project that I was involved in, they were relocating it to a bedroom, but that's not important. But yeah, definitely for protection, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. I'll send you some examples.
So there are lots of comments in the chat, Brian, from people saying how much they enjoyed your presentation. So I think we'll wrap it up here because we've gone over time, but I'm sure people will contact you with questions and maybe pictures, and it was really fascinating talk. So thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone for listening.